The City of Lights went dark when Nazi forces marched through Paris on June 14, 1940. The world watched in stunned silence, but the cameras never captured what happened next. Behind closed doors, in cobblestone alleyways, and inside homes that once echoed with laughter, French women faced a reality so brutal, so deeply human that history barely dared to whisper it. Some survived through courage, others through impossible choices, and some simply vanished. What really happened to the women of Paris after the fall is a story that will shake you to your core. The day Paris fell silent. June 14, 1940 began like a wound that would never fully heal. The streets of Paris, once alive with the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of children, and the music spilling from cafe doorways, had transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. German soldiers marched in perfect formation down the Champs-Élysées, their boots striking the cobblestones in a rhythm that felt like a death knell for everything the French people had ever known. But where were the Parisians? Nearly 2 million people had already fled the city in what became known as the Exode, the Great Exodus. Whatever they could carry onto bicycles, carts, and cars. Mothers clutched their children. Elderly couples who had survived the First World War walked miles on bleeding feet rather than face what was coming. The roads out of Paris became rivers of human desperation, clogged with people who had abandoned their homes, their memories, and their entire lives behind them. For the women who stayed, the city they woke up to on that morning was not their Paris anymore. And that was only the beginning. And of the women left behind, not every woman could run. Many stayed because they had nowhere to go. Others stayed to protect elderly parents, sick children, or family businesses built across generations. Some stayed simply because they believed, with a stubborn and heartbreaking hope, that it could not possibly be as bad as everyone feared. They were wrong. The German occupation brought with it an entirely new set of rules, and French women found themselves navigating a world where every single decision carried life-altering consequences. Food was rationed so severely that malnutrition became common. The black market became not a criminal enterprise, but a matter of survival. Women traded jewelry, clothing, and family heirlooms just to feed their children one more meal. But hunger was only one weapon the occupation used against them, and the psychological terror was equally devastating. German soldiers were everywhere, billeted inside French homes, seated at French tables, sleeping in French beds. Women had to smile, cooperate, and perform normalcy while quietly suffocating under the weight of humiliation. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, one neighbor willing to whisper a lie to the wrong person, and a woman could disappear into the nightmare of the Gestapo's hands. And thousands did. The impossible choice. Here is where history gets deeply uncomfortable, and where the story of French women becomes one of the most morally complex chapters of the entire war. Survival required compromise. For some women, that compromise meant trading on the black market or hiding Jewish neighbors in attic spaces, acts of breathtaking courage that risked everything. For others, survival meant something far more painful to acknowledge. Some French women entered into relationships with German soldiers. Some did so willingly, many did not. The line between collaboration and coercion was rarely clean, and history has not always been kind enough to recognize that distinction. These women were called horizontal collaborators, a term dripping with contempt that erased the impossible circumstances many of them faced. A widow with 3 starving children had different choices than a woman with resources and freedom. A young girl threatened by a soldier with a gun had no real choice at all. Yet for decades, the nuance was ignored, and the shame was placed entirely on the women themselves, rather than on the system of occupation that created those conditions in the first place. But there is another side to this story, a side that burns with defiance. The women who fought back. While some women were forced into impossible compromises, others channeled their fear and fury into something extraordinary. The French resistance was not built only by men with guns. It was built in kitchens, in schoolrooms, in hospitals, and in the quiet, determined hearts of women who refused to accept defeat. Women like Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who led one of the largest resistance networks in all of occupied France, a network called Alliance. which the Gestapo nicknamed Noah's Ark. She was arrested twice and escaped both times, once by squeezing through the bars of her prison cell after contorting her body in a feat of sheer will and desperation. She went on to save hundreds of lives, women like Lucy Aubrac, who orchestrated the daring armed rescue of her husband from Gestapo custody while she was pregnant, outwitting some of the most feared secret police in history with nothing but her intelligence and her nerve. Women who carried forged documents hidden inside loaves of bread. Women who memorized messages and delivered them across enemy checkpoints with steady hands and calm faces while their hearts hammered inside their chests. Women who sheltered Allied airmen in their homes, knowing that if discovered, death was the only outcome waiting for them. These women did not make it into the history books quickly enough, but they were there, and they were extraordinary. Liberation and its brutal aftermath. Then came August 1944, liberated. The crowds flooded the streets, tears streaming, voices rising in the Marseillaise, arms reaching toward the sky in relief and joy. For one shining moment, it seemed like the darkness was finally over. But for some French women, liberation brought a new and savage punishment. Across France, women accused of collaborating with German soldiers were dragged into public squares. Their heads were shaved. They were paraded through jeering crowds, sometimes stripped, sometimes beaten, always humiliated in ways designed to mark them permanently as traitors. The French called it épuration sauvage, the savage purge. Approximately 20,000 women suffered this fate across France. Some of them had genuinely collaborated with enthusiasm, but many had simply been trying to survive. Many had been victims of assault who were now being punished as though the crime had been their own. The violence of the purge was not justice, but it was a society desperately trying to cleanse its own guilt by placing it onto the bodies of women. The men who had collaborated, who had signed orders, run businesses for the Nazis, and profited from Jewish deportations, largely walked free. The women, many of them powerless and poor, bore the visible shame alone. History does not forget, and neither should we. The women history almost forgot. The full story of what French women endured after Paris fell took decades to surface. For a long time, France preferred a cleaner narrative, one of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph. The complexity, the suffering, the moral gray areas, and the injustice of the purges were quietly set aside. But the women were real. Their choices were real. Their suffering was real. And their courage, both the dramatic kind and the quieter, in daily kind that never made headlines, was perhaps the most real thing of all. Paris fell, but the women of France did not. They bent under the weight of occupation, compromise, terror, and betrayal. Some broke, some were broken by others, but an extraordinary number of them held the line of humanity together with their bare hands in ways that history is only now beginning to fully honor. The City of Lights went dark on June 14, 1940. But somewhere in the shadows, women were already figuring out how to keep the flame alive. And that is a story that will never stop mattering.